In an earlier lecture, we introduced the idea of cell references. However, there are a couple different types of cell references that we can make, and these will change depending on our use case. Before we get started, just a friendly reminder about the language in this lecture. The referencing cell is the cell that has the formula, but the reference cell is the one that is being pointed to. Here in my spreadsheet, I have put headings for all four types of cell references: relative, absolute, mixed with the row locked, and mixed with the column locked. All of these may be useful at some point, depending on your use case, and do not fret, they're all going to be covered in this video. Let's start with relative references. Excel's default is a relative reference, so to do a relative reference, we just do a regular cell reference by typing equals, and let's choose the top cell. Hit enter. The reason that this is a relative cell reference is because if I use the fill handle to drag it down, the value changes. If we look into these formulas, we see that for every one row that our referencing cell moves down, the reference cell also moves down. This is what we call a relative cell reference, where the reference cell moves relative to the referencing cell. The reference cell will always be the same distance from the referencing cell. This is true no matter where we copy and paste the formula inside of our spreadsheet. There may be some scenarios in which we want to make an absolute cell reference, or one that does not change based on the location of the referencing cell. To do this, we would first make a regular cell reference to the cell we want, and then put a cash sign in front of the letter, and then a cash sign in front of the number. This is how we tell Excel that we're locking the cell reference. Now, if we copy and paste the formula anywhere, we can see that it stays fixed on that original cell. This is why it's called an absolute cell reference. No matter where you put the referencing cell, it will always stay on the reference cell. Okay, now that we've gone over relative and absolute cell references, we need to review mixed references. While relative references are not fixed in any dimensions, and absolute references are locked in 2 dimensions, mixed references are locked in one of 2 dimensions. You can either lock the column or the row. Let's try it. Let's once again start by making a relative cell reference to the top cell. Remember, in Excel, the numbers represent the rows and the letters represent the columns. So in order to lock the row, we only need to put the $sign in front of the row. Hit enter. If I try to use the fill handle to move this reference downwards, we can see that the reference stays fixed on bakery items. However, if we move it rightwards, we see that Excel is now transposing the data to the right of the cell. Why is this happening? This is happening because we locked the row and not the column. Therefore, the column, the left to right, is free to reference other cells relatively, while the row, up and down, stays fixed. Okay, let's move on and try a mixed reference with a locked column. Let's do our regular cell reference once again. And this time, let's put our $sign in front of the A instead of the 3. Now, when we try to move this formula downwards, we can see that Excel is properly transposing the data below the cell. However, if we move to the right, we see that Excel stays locked on that column. This is because we have locked the column and not the row. Therefore, the row is free to reference other cells relatively, while the column is locked. Okay, now that we've covered all of the different types of cell references, let me show you the shortcut to lock a cell as well. When you create a cell reference, you can use the F4 key to toggle through the different types of locking. If you use F4 once, it locks both, creating an absolute reference. If you press it again, it locks the row and not the column. And if you press it again, it'll lock the column and not the row. And finally, if you press it one more time, it'll bring it back to a relative cell reference. So you might be asking yourself, when might this be important when I'm building an Excel spreadsheet? Let me show you an example right now. Let's say we wanted to understand the percentage of sales of each of our grocery items. If you remember from your high school math class, a percentage is simply a number ratio expressed as a fraction of 100. If you'd like an in-depth explanation, please refer to the link in the lecture notes. Okay, let's give it a go. Let's add a new column called percentage of sales. This column will contain a value that represents the percentage of our sales that each grocery item represents. Let's start by calculating the percentage of sales of cupcakes. To do this, I'll type equals, and since percentage is just part over whole, the part is the cupcake and the whole is the total sales. Hit enter, and we see that Excel is giving us this kind of cryptic $0. That's because it's not formatted correctly. We want to go ahead and format this as a percentage. And now that looks a little bit more accurate. Now, we can use the fill handle to click and drag downwards, but wait a second, it appears that our reference has broke. Why might this be happening? Well, here we're dividing B4 by B8, which works, but when we move below, we're actually dividing B5 by B9, and B9 is blank. This is a perfect example of where we need an absolute cell reference. We need to lock our cell reference on B8 so that doesn't move, but B4 stays free to move. To do this, I'm going to use the shortcut F4 to lock my reference to B8. Now I should be able to use the fill handle to click and drag this down. Now that looks much more accurate to me.